But the point is that we put this in the hands of the Iranian government. If they hadn't done that, we may have had to launch a full regime. What would Donald Trump have done if 50 or 100 Americans had been killed in an Iranian attack?
Well, thankfully,
we risked a catastrophe.
Thankfully.
So recently, Dave Smith had a debate on the Piers Morgan podcast with Elisa Laban. She pitched the pro-Zionist case for the recent U.S. intervention in Iran on behalf of Israel. And Dave Smith argues against her, smacking her down. Just my guess, I haven't seen it yet, but knowing Dave, this is going to be interesting. Dave arguing that policy was not only destructive and counterintuitive and risked American lives over this catastrophe. So let's watch and let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Dave, you on 22nd of June, and I've obviously talked to you on the show as well around this period, you posted on X, Donald Trump's now launched an illegal war of aggression against Iran. The risk of an absolute catastrophe is very high and the benefits are non-existent. Worst of all, he did it on behalf of a foreign government against a country who posed no threat to us. Now, as things stand, it looks increasingly like Trump brought all this to an end with targeting 3 nuclear strikes with the B-2 bunker buster bombs. We don't know the scale of the damage, but even the Iranians are saying significant. And the war appears to be now at a ceasefire stage after 12 days, which is being kept in hell, which I'm astonished by. Trump has no desire, made it clear, to put any boots on the ground or to affect any America-driven regime change. I think he was misinterpreted when he first talked about that. I think he meant an organic regime change possibly happening a la Syria in December, but we don't know. But that was my take on what he said. But he certainly clarified that now as he doesn't want Americans to force it. What is actually wrong with what has happened and unfurled here? I mean, given what the Atomic Agency report made clear, that the Iranians have been enriching uranium from a safe civilian usage of 3.5–4% to 60% in rapid time. And they were hiding information, they were obfuscating, they weren't allowing proper, full, transparent inspections and so on. You know, is there really anything ideological on putting aside Gaza, putting aside everything else, purely on the apparently
Finish the
imminent
question,
threat?
Pierce.
I mean, in the
Finish
next
the
few months,
question.
that the Iranians would have had an ability to weaponize their uranium quite quickly to 90% and potentially create up to 10 nuclear bombs, having assured the world they wouldn't do that. They are supporting and promoting every terror group going from Hezbollah to the Houthis to Hamas to destroy Israel. If you're Israel, why would you not preemptively strike? And if you're the United States and you've got the leaders of the Iranian regime saying death to America and encouraging that chant, why would you also not want to neutralize the nuclear sites?
Well, let me start by saying that I really am just absolutely thrilled that, number one, that the Iranians gave that warning and that their response was kind of like one of those Iranian responses where we want to seem tough, but we sure do want to make sure we don't kill any Americans that could get us destroyed. And I'm thrilled that Donald Trump took that off-ramp and immediately started pushing a ceasefire. I mean, who knows what's going to happen, but thank God that he did that, because, and I think all sane people around the world should be thankful that he took that off-ramp and this didn't lead to a catastrophe.
His guest isn't. His debate opponent is clearly not thrilled about that. Mark Levin isn't thrilled about that. Ben Shapiro isn't thrilled about that. John Bolton isn't thrilled about that, clearly.
Catastrophe. But no, I mean, I think that I think essentially your question is all flawed. I mean, even in the IAEA report that you're referring to, they also reiterated that Iran doesn't have a nuclear bomb and that they have not made the decision to start pursuing one. And so there was no imminent threat. Listen, even Benjamin Netanyahu, in his interview with Brett Baer, who always, Piers, as you know, has a long history of just making up how long the Iranians are to developing a nuke, even he said maybe a year, 13 months. But the point is that in order for them to do that, they would have had to kick the inspectors out. And then it would have taken them at least a matter of years to develop a nuclear bomb if they had made the political decision to start seeking one, and then it would have taken them a while.
And there's no indication they even made that political decision. In fact, Tulsi Gabbard's threat report from 7 weeks ago said that there was no evidence that they had restarted it. And they were under compliance with the IAEA. They're part of the NPT. And Israel has exempted itself, and they have the secret nuclear weapons program, not Iran. So Dave's right. We had to rely on Iranian restraint in this. And I'm glad that Trump took the off-ramp, but the Iranians were more restrained in their response because they didn't want to provoke the U.S. into regime change. We were about this close from that.
Have one.
My point.
Do you think Iran should have a nuclear bomb?
No, I don't think anybody should have nuclear weapons.
Right, but do you think in particular Iran should have one, given how much it supports terrorist groups?
Well, I will answer that question. Let me just say the point I was making there is just that there was no imminent threat. We had more than enough time to do what the American legal system requires in this situation, which is that you bring it to Congress so that the people theoretically can have a debate through their representatives and a declaration.
And that's such a farce because it hasn't happened in terms of a war declaration since World War II. Of course, we got the AUMF under Bush to, invade Iraq and invade Afghanistan, but they don't even go through those steps anymore. They just allow the president, regardless of political affinity or political tribe, to just launch these missile strikes across the world, no matter what, at the behest of Israel in this case.
David, I saw AOC making that argument, and I replied to her, almost every military strike ordered by an American president this century has been done without prior congressional approval.
And that's the problem, that regardless of which presidents do it, that's still a problem because our founders didn't want to have a king. They didn't want to just emulate what the king could do under the British system and declare war on his own. Of course, even in the English system, Congress had some role of nullifying wars by refusing to generate income through taxation. That's what they did to Charles I. But the English king could do this unilaterally. And this, they said in the Philadelphia Convention, you can see even the most prominent nationalists like Alexander Hamilton said, well, where the sword is in one hand and the bank is in the other, there will be no danger because the people's representatives will be involved in these decisions. Of course, that's not what we have now.
Yeah, but what type of argument is that, Pierce? Every war since World War II has been fought undeclared. That doesn't mean it's the proper
But the
legal,
argument is that
system.
if you go for congressional approval, inevitably it will leak out and you lose the element of surprise.
Yeah, okay, but then the argument also is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the founders very intentionally placed war-making power in the Congress.
That's right. In Article 6 of the Constitution, it says, this Constitution and all laws made in pursuance thereof and all treaties made under the authority of the United States are the supreme law of the land. It isn't arbitrary decisions of the executive that are the supreme law of the land. Sorry, Trump fans. And under Biden, sorry, Biden fans, if there were any, by the way. Under Obama fans, sorry, Obama. And for Bush fans, sorry, Bush.
Because they didn't want it to be, they didn't want the president to have the war-making powers of a king.
Now, exactly.
Commander-in-chief can make military strikes as well. It just can't declare war.
Yeah, well, there's some debate about that amongst constitutional scholars, but yes, but that refers to like an imminent threat, which by all accounts this wasn't. Now, listen.
No, this was, she's saying, yes, there was an imminent threat against the United States. Like, I can't even believe the people that you can find to argue this stuff.
I don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. I think that everything that U.S. but basically all of U.S. and Israeli foreign policy seems to have been geared around incentivizing them to make one for about as long as I've been alive, which I think is very counterproductive.
Exactly.
But I will say that I think there is a couple thoughts here that I think people should really consider. And number one, that I don't, I still think that Donald Trump, as great as it is that he walked us back from this, I think it was totally reckless and wrong for him to launch it to begin with. But think about this. The whole foundational claim for the Hawks' justification about Iran getting a nuke here, because obviously lots of really, really bad people have had nuclear weapons in the history of the world, and that's not a good thing. But like Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong and like, today, current Vladimir Putin, China, I mean, there's lots of really bad regimes that have nuclear weapons. It's almost never been on the table among serious people that we ought to launch a war of aggression and choice because a regime. But the claim here is that Iran is so crazy. There are these religious fundamentalists, and self-preservation simply isn't a motivating factor for them, and therefore they can't be allowed to get it.
But you wouldn't dispute that it. But you wouldn't. But Dave, hang on. You wouldn't dispute. But you wouldn't dispute though the central argument that Israel has about it, which is that Iran has been the main sponsor for Hamas, the Houthis and Hezbollah for a number of years, all of whom are terror groups wedded to eliminating Israel.
I don't know if they're the main group. In fact, Hamas was supported by Netanyahu, including in a maneuver 2 weeks before October 7th. And this isn't a conspiracy theory. If you Google that, the New York Times, the Times of Israel, Haaretz has all reported on this, that Netanyahu wanted to support Hamas to destabilize the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian cause in general, so that they would never get a second state, a two-state solution. So I don't know about most support, but, he could be wrong there. I'm not sure.
Wouldn't dispute that.
I don't dispute that they have supported those groups, and I don't dispute that that's the
So
Israeli
isn't that
claim. I
right
think it's
there,
fairly-
the existential threat to Israel?
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, but Israel.
But we're Americans. That's the problem. Our American political system, they are not a threat to. And we shouldn't police the world, even if that's the conclusion that you draw. Which, it's not like they're trying to invade Israel right now anyways.
No, listen, if Israel is the only country in the Middle East who secretly has nuclear weapons and is not a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they also funded Hamas. So I'm sorry, I do not think it's a legitimate justification for them to launch a war because they claim someone else is making nukes when they're not, and also they also funded Hamas or something like that. So no.
Can I respond to this now? First of all, this claim that there's no evidence that the regime is making nukes is totally false. It's totally false. We know that they've enriched to 60%, which means they're 90% of the way there. There's no reason to have anything above 3 to 5% for civilian use.
That's not true. Some medicines take about 20% enrichment, and that's not talked about much, so I can't exactly blame her that much, but it's not totally true. And they're not 90% of the way. Even if you're enriching uranium to 60%, it requires at least 90% plus of all the process that it takes to build the nuke after that, which means using centrifuges and then turning that uranium material, enriching it back to a metal, and then creating it that way. I don't know all the particulars. This isn't my skill set, but there's more to it than that. It certainly wasn't 90%. And Tulsi Gabbard completely threw that allegation out the window until one day before the U.S. strike when she says, well, they might be weeks away. And that wasn't even as radical as Netanyahu said, which Dave brought up in this interview, that, they might be a year away or 13 months. So
everybody understands that 60%, the only purpose of it is for nuclear weapons.
It's not. It's a deterrent without having a nuclear weapon. If you enrich to 60%, it's the same as if you don't have a nuke and you enrich to 0%. It would take enriching to 90%. Why they wanted it 60% is to provide a deterrent to attack them without actually having a nuclear weapon. That's what's happening here. And by the way, after this, I think they want to enrich to 90%. I think they'll want to gain a nuclear weapon. So all this has done is encourage and inspire them.
Now, for a long time, the US and the Western world have been trying to delay the breakout time. That was the whole point of the JCPOA and all of these other deals, was that we know that they're months away, right? That's why you keep saying, oh, they've been months away for years, right? But they've been trying to extend the breakout time from months away to at least a year away for the past 10 to 15 years. So actually, everybody is fully aware that the regime has always been months away.
Actually, what they've tried to extend is the war propaganda campaign to always say neither that they don't have them or they do have them, and always say that they're weeks from having them or months from having them to drum up a regime change war in Iran. That's what they want to extend, not the window. They were complying under the JCPOA, and every congressional record and document suggests that. They were allowing the inspections, and they didn't enrich uranium past the requisite amount they need for their energy program and medicines until the Trump administration shredded the JCPOA.
From developing nuclear weapons. Now, second of all, again, it's making these moral equivalencies between the United States or different countries or Israel or whoever having nuclear capabilities. What you're talking about here is a regime whose fundamental motto, its entire basis of existence, is death to Israel and death to the United States. That is what it stands for. That is what its leaders chant on a daily basis. That is what school children have to chant in the playground before they start school every day.
And what's it doing to threaten us? It's not being corresponded with actions, with corresponding actions that represent it. So you're literally saying that words are violence, that these chants are violence. That's so ridiculous, I can't even quantify it. But that's the propaganda we've been led to believe forever, that they want to wipe Israel off the map. They want to destroy as many American lives as they can. Well, what did they do when faced with that decision? Did they wipe Israel off the map? Did they destroy a lot of American lives? No. They were remarkably restrained, and they even tipped Trump off to their strike. So no, I'm not buying the death to American chance propaganda anymore. This is bogus.
Death to America, death to Israel. Every day, their strategy is how do we destroy the United States and how do we destroy Israel? Now, when you have an expansionist ideology that has eschatological beliefs about the end of the world and the end of Israel, and the desire is to proliferate and export its ideology of velayat faqih, not just to the Middle East, but to the entire world, and you say, I don't understand what's the difference between them having nukes and others having nukes, that is just profoundly misguided. Second of all,
I didn't say that.
Second of all, this isn't just about the threat of the nukes themselves. I don't think anyone's thinking to themselves that that the Islamic Republic's just going to drop a nuke as soon as it has one. The whole point of it reaching nuclear capabilities is that it becomes a deterrent state. Once it becomes a deterrent state, how are you going to deter its bad behaviors? How are you going to...
You don't. That's the point. You don't get into regime change wars at that point. That's why we don't get into regime change wars with North Korea or China or Russia or Pakistan or India or Britain, because they have nukes and it deters that. That's a good thing. We don't want their regime cleansed out with the help of American aid to do that and have another Afghanistan or Iraq, a 20-year occupation on our hands where countless amounts of treasury gets expended, hundreds of thousands of lives get expended over the course of 20 years to replace the Taliban with the Taliban, or the Khomeini regime with a new Khomeini or a Shah, the Pahlavi dynasty again. That's what we want to avoid. We don't want that. So yeah, it would be a deterrent. And guess what? If I'm Iran, the first thing I need right now is a deterrent because of this. I had less reason before this. Now I have all the reason after this to acquire nuclear weapons. So all this has done is just proven all the neocons wrong. Number one, that now Iran probably will try to acquire nukes. And number two, they didn't act in any way according to the propaganda, the death to America and wipe Israel off the map.
Prevent its alliances with its regional proxies. How are you going to prevent more October 7th when everything you try to do to sanction them and contain them is met with, what are you going to do? We've got nukes. And it also prevents the containment of the region, because now UAE, Egypt, all of these other countries are so under threat that they also have to develop nuclear capabilities. So it is actually allowing them to get that far. That would be the cause of regional and global instability. So it's just preposterous to say that we should have just done nothing about that or got into another deal that just kicked the can down the road again. We are in the position that we are in because nobody contained this for as many decades as it's been a growing threat. We've passed the Neville Chamberlain moment.
Okay.
Totally. It's just total bullshit. I mean, just listen.
It is. And I got to say, before we listen to Dave, it's cheeky, I'll use that term ironically, that a British citizen, I believe she's British, wants to agitate for more U.S. funding and more U.S. wars on the part of Israel. Well, why don't we let that be your country's problem instead of ours, and we just back off? That would be much better for Americans. But no, you have to lobby our country to get involved in this when this isn't our war to fight. So let's just listen to Dave, though.
The reason why now this 60% enrichment, which obviously for anyone paying attention, was there is another reason besides they were developing a nuclear weapon, which again, all of the intelligence says they had not even made the political decision that they wanted to develop a nuclear weapon yet, let alone weren't doing it. It was a chip to bargain away, which is actually what they were trying to do. They were in the middle of negotiations when Israel snuck attack them and launched this war of aggression.
That means you concede. Hang on. That means you concede that what they were doing was creating the impression that they were going to build a nuclear bomb.
Oh, listen, there's no question that they upped the enrichment. But listen, here's the point. They weren't allowed to, under the JCPOA. Okay. Under the JCPOA, when America was involved, they weren't allowed to enrich to this level, but they were allowed to do it if America pulled out. That's in the JCPOA.
Correct. They can enrich to whatever level now that Trump shredded the JCPOA. Before that, they couldn't. They're part of the NPT. They're still subject to IAEA compliance, which, by the way, Israel isn't, by the way, which is another ultimate irony of this. But Dave's right.
Agreement. And so when Donald Trump tore that up, and walked away, they brought their enrichment up. What were the negotiations, Pierce, that were happening right before Israel launched their surprise attack? It was for Iran to bring the enrichment back down and America to get back in some type of agreement. They weren't going to call it the JCPOA because Donald Trump would have had to make it his own thing. And
Trump
not
gave
back
them
into
60
Obama's.
days to negotiate. Trump said he got 60 days, and day 61, Israel attacked.
That's not what happened. He did give a 60-day warning, but what happened during that course was the Trump diplomatic team went from a mandate of you can't have a nuclear enrichment program, we're going to have inspections, etc., and that's what we're primarily asking here, to in early June, they switched. They switched on a dime. Iran never changed their perspective, but all of a sudden you heard the American team headed by Witkoff and others say, well, you can't have any nuclear enrichment whatsoever. That's a non-starter. It could never have worked. Iran relies upon the nuclear energy program that some form of enrichment requires. And basically every modern country around the world has that. So if you're going to switch that was a total non-starter designed to tank these negotiations. It was the U.S. that tanked these negotiations and refused to negotiate in the end, not Iran. And I think that the reason for that's clear, that Trump knew in advance that he was going to collaborate with Netanyahu to do this strike. And they strategized from that point forward. And that's what undermined the negotiations, not Iran.
Right. Okay. Now, but what happened, and this was widely reported, and Donald Trump himself acknowledged this, is that the hawks insisted that you put a poison pill in the negotiations. This is what Mark Levin was freaking out about, and that the standard has to be that Iran must give up all nuclear enrichment altogether. This was always a poison pill, so that the point is that Iran was willing to negotiate, and so if you really wanted to get back into that deal, Donald Trump honestly just never should have torn up the JCPOA, and we'd all be in a much better situation. It ushered in a new inspection regime. And so this is why we know that they're enriching up to 60%, because they're still in the agreement and they still have the inspections, unlike Israel.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this. I'm sure since you know about the JCPOA, I'm sure you know that it was replete with sunset provisions for up to 10 to 15 years, where all of those containment would be expired, and they would have more than $150 billion to continue developing their missiles and nuclear programs. The JCPOA was never a solution. Not only that, but not only did they inherit more than $100 billion, they were also able to expand their regional terror. And Khamenei repeatedly came on television and said, we are going to use that money to fund our allies. So there was actually a backdoor to the JCPOA where the regime, the Islamic Republic, was able to expand its regional influence and fund its allies, which eventually led to October 7th, which eventually brought us to where we are now. So yes, the JCPOA did intend to temporarily constrain their nuclear abilities, but
it did, and by all accounts, all the congressional testimony, even the regime most likely willing to drum up foreign wars and the CIA and the deep state, all the documents that came into Congress said that they were complying. And by ripping up that agreement, it gave Netanyahu the pretext that he needed to get the U.S. involved in this war. So, this is crazy for someone that if they genuinely have the belief that we need to curtail their nuclear weapons program, you should have supported the JCPOA. That's not what the Israel lobby wanted, though, because then regime change was off the table.
It was always understood that by the time it expired, they would be $150 billion richer. Their proxies would be fortified. They would have been responsible for significant regional destabilization, and then they would be able to enrich if they wanted to. And the only way to prevent that was to get into another nuclear deal, which would require unfreezing hundreds and billions of more. So they would just keep getting enriched and empowered. So the question is, how does this end? Just a lifetime of JCPOAs?
Well, let me ask you a question just to end this, because we've run out of time. Dave, hang on. Let me put a question to Dave, which is that if it turns out that all this activity in the last 2 weeks drives Iran to the negotiating table, they do agree to give up.
Bold prediction, that doesn't happen. That's my bold prediction. They don't go back to the negotiating table, and neither would I. You know what I'd spend my time doing instead of going back to that negotiating table with the U.S., the duplicitous U.S., who undermined their own interests to serve Israel in their, attempt at drawing us into a regime change war. You know what I'd do instead? I'd fast track some nuclear weapons right now. That's what I would do.
A lot of their enriched uranium and so on, reduce it back to civilian levels and so on. And there is a period of sustained peace in the region, and the Gaza hell is brought to an end as well. And in 6 months' time, all this is over. Should Donald Trump get the Nobel Peace Prize? Because Barack Obama got one 8 months into his tenure for basically just doing a bit of fancy chat about world peace.
Well, I guess grading on the Obama curve, everybody deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, literally, the three of us are much better candidates than Barack Obama was. So judging on that curve. No, look, I mean, I think that would be great if that's the result of all of this. I think that Donald Trump's policy was so reckless, and it had such a risk. And this is what I was trying to get at before that I hope people appreciate. Look, if Iran had not made the calculation to give advanced warning and had just fired off missiles the way they did into Israel. But this is the whole point, Piers.
I think Trump called their bluff. I think Trump called their bluff because he realized that what Israel had done over a period of days is expose the Iranian regime as having a military that was a dud.
Piers,
couldn't even deal with what Israel was flying at.
They don't want to be destroyed.
They wisely saw that if they would have eliminated U.S. soldiers in the bases thereabouts, which there were about 45,000 servicemen in that region, in the northeastern, side of the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, within striking distance of Iran. I think there are actually some bases to the northeast of Iran too. I don't think there's as many as there used to be there, but they were in striking range. They could have done serious damage to U.S. forces. You know why they don't want to? Like he said, it's self-preservation. They didn't want to draw the U.S. into what would have been a regime change war. And guess what? I think Trump would have sold that. I think he would have had the political capital to sell it at that point. Now, I'm glad his instincts were not for regime change. But if they would have been attacked and, hundreds of U.S. servicemen would have died, I think he would have reconsidered that. And that would have been the worst case scenario that we don't want to have played out. So I'm glad what happened, but Dave's right. The restraint on the Iranian side was considerable. And that's why essentially the Israelis rolled the dice on all of our lives. The Americans that joined in and helped the Israeli strike against Iran rolled the dice on all of our lives. And the worst did not come to fruition, but it's only because Iranian constraint.
Would rather rule than be destroyed.
Exactly.
But the point is that we put this in the hands of the Iranian government. If they hadn't done that, we may have had to launch a full regime. What would Donald Trump have done if 50 or 100 Americans had been killed in an Iranian attack?
Well, thankfully, that has not.
We risked a catastrophe.
Thankfully, that hasn't happened because Iran was so panicky, they actually gave prior warnings to everybody to make sure it didn't happen.
So maybe they're not such a scary threat after all.
Well, that's an interesting point if you take away their nuclear weapons.
I love how that ended. The Zionists could not take that last comment from Dave. But look, Dave was totally right here. I'm a little bit biased, and I think he always performs very well during these kind of debates, but he just destroyed this broad, I think, if you ask me. He's totally right. This U.S. strike against the Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities, the 3 ones, was a failure. They're celebrating it as if it was a great success, but it was a failure if the success condition, the end game condition, the victory condition of it was to destroy their nuclear enrichment process, because it looks like at least a lot of the uranium got taken out of at least Fordo weeks in advance. And we have stories of that from Seymour Hersh and the Gray Zone and others showing satellite imagery of vans in a long kind of arrangement arrived there several weeks ago, presumably to get a lot of that. Plus, it's hard to know what's under all that rubble, but it can be pretty assured that if I'm Iranian, if I have any highly enriched uranium left, I am going to try to build nuclear weapons after this especially. It just makes too much sense. And Mearsheimer made this point on a different podcast too. He said, even if you were to regime change Iran and you installed the Shah, the Pahlavi's son, the deposed Shah's son in, which a lot of the Zionists actually want to do in that region again, is, to make kind of a comeback war propaganda effort to usher in a regime change with him at the head. Even if it's him, I think they'll seek nuclear weapons. It just makes too much sense to. So Dave is right here. There was a lot of risk put into this operation, and it really rolled the dice, not only on American lives, especially the servicemen in the region, but also Israeli lives. And whether this ceasefire holds or not, I don't know. I see this continuing, the cycle of war propaganda and trying to agitate the U.S. into another regime change war continuing, especially on the part of the neocons and Netanyahu, constantly clamoring for it. People that are on the establishment right that want this, and the establishment left that want this. The Uniparty, the Israel lobby, AIPAC is all going to lobby hard for this. And for now, the Trump administration celebrating this like, oh, great, mission accomplished. Mission accomplished. We think we took it all out. Trump said, we think we took it all out. Our servicemen performed admirably and greatly, and all this. Hegseth said the same. But Trump also said, I didn't want regime change. Regime change brings chaos. Well, good. You put us within an inch of potentially launching one and trying to sell one. You flirted with regime change on Truth Social. And how are people supposed to interpret that after living through Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Syria, by the way? But then at the end, he left the trail dangling a little bit by saying, well, they can't have nuclear. Well, if it's nuclear enrichment, this war is going to come back soon because they are going to have a nuclear energy program, whether the U.S. wants it or not. The biggest irony here is Israel is a country with a secret nuclear weapons program that they won't admit. It's the worst kept secret in geopolitics, striking a country for fear that it had a secret nuclear weapons program that they didn't have. So that's where we're at. Let me know in the comments below who won this debate. Was it Dave? Was it Elisa? How did Piers Morgan do in terms of, guiding the conversation here? Anything I missed? I want to hear from you guys on that. Please do subscribe to Piers Morgan. His show is really entertaining. I think he's kind of like the Jerry Springer of politics now on YouTube. Like my video, subscribe to my channel, and please consider becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon patron to support me. I'd really appreciate that. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.